My name is Frank. I'm 68 years old, and 3 years ago I packed 2 suitcases, left a 31-year marriage in Sacramento, California, and moved alone to a small island in the Philippines. I know how that sounds. I know exactly how that sounds. So before you assume anything, let me tell you the whole story. Not the version people whispered about at my daughter's wedding, but what actually happened, and why, 3 years later, I still believe it was the best decision of my entire life. Carol and I got married in 1992. We had 2 kids, a house in a decent Sacramento suburb, 2 cars in the driveway, and for a long time, by every outside measure, we had a good life. But somewhere around 2015, something in our marriage went quiet, in a way that never got loud again. We weren't fighting. That's the part people don't understand. There was no affair, no big betrayal, no screaming matches the neighbors could hear through the walls. We just slowly stopped being 2 people who wanted to be in the same room. We'd sit across from each other at dinner, and I'd realize we hadn't said more than 10 words to each other in an hour, and neither of us seemed particularly bothered by that anymore. I worked 34 years as a mid-level manager at a logistics company. Carol worked part-time at a school district office. We were financially fine, comfortable even, but emotionally, we'd become something closer to roommates who split a mortgage and occasionally attended the same Thanksgiving dinner. I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering in a video like this. I'm not going to tell you Carol was a bad person, or that I was some victim of a terrible marriage. She wasn't cruel to me. I don't think I was particularly cruel to her either, not on purpose. We just quietly grew into 2 different people over 3 decades, and neither of us had the courage to say it out loud until I finally did, at 65 years old, sitting in a marriage counselor's office that Carol had actually suggested we try. The counselor, a calm woman named Dr. Fenwick, asked us both a simple question in our 4th session. She asked, "If neither of you were afraid of what your kids or your friends would think, would you still choose this marriage today?" Carol didn't answer. I didn't answer either. The silence in that room lasted almost a full minute, and it told us both everything we needed to know. We separated quietly in early 2022. No lawyers throwing accusations, no dividing up the silverware in some ugly scene. We split what we had fairly, sold the house, and went our separate ways as calmly as 31 years allows 2 people to go. My son Danny took it hard at first. He called me and asked, almost angry, "Dad, are you having some kind of crisis? Is this a midlife thing?" I told him I was 65, so if anything it was a very late life thing, and that seemed to land better as a joke than it probably deserved to. My daughter Michelle was more understanding. She told me something I've held on to since. She said, "Dad, I've watched you and Mom be polite roommates for 10 years. I'd rather you both actually be happy separately than pretend to be happy together for our sake." With my half of the house sale and my pension, I had about $210,000 and a fixed retirement income of just under $2,400 a month between my pension and Social Security. In Sacramento, on my own, that would have meant a small apartment, a tight budget, and honestly, a lonely little life rebuilding itself from scratch in the same city full of memories of a marriage that had just ended. A former coworker of mine, Gary, retired 2 years before me, had moved to a small island called Siquijor in the Philippines, and he'd been sending me photos for over a year. Turquoise water, a modest but beautiful bungalow he was renting for $300 a month, a whole new circle of friends he'd built at 67 years old. I used to look at those photos and think he was living some kind of fantasy that wasn't real. After the divorce was finalized, I called him and asked if it actually was real, or if he was just putting a good face on things for social media the way everybody does. He laughed and told me to come see for myself. I flew to Siquijor in September of 2022, 4 months after the divorce was final. I told myself it was just a 2-week visit to clear my head. I ended up extending the trip twice, and by the time I flew back to California to pack up the rest of my life, I'd already signed a year's lease on a small house near the coast. My kids thought I'd lost my mind. My son asked me point blank, "Dad, are you running from something?" And I gave him an honest answer this time. I said, "Son, I spent 31 years quietly disappearing inside a marriage that both your mother and I let go stale. I'm not running from anything. I'm running toward the first 30 years of my life where I get to actually decide who I am, without anybody else's expectations attached to it." I sold or gave away almost everything. Furniture, most of my clothes, a garage full of tools I hadn't touched in a decade. I kept my father's old fishing rod, a small box of photographs of my kids growing up, and not much else. Watching 30 years of accumulated belongings get carted off in a single afternoon should have felt devastating. Instead, it felt like exhaling after holding my breath for a very long time. Siquijor hit me differently than I expected. It's a small island, quieter and less developed than places like Cebu or Boracay, known locally for old folk legends about healers and mystics, though these days it's mostly just a peaceful, laid-back place with some of the clearest water I've ever seen in my life. I rented a modest 2-bedroom bungalow for $300 a month, ceiling fans instead of air conditioning, a small porch that looked out over a coconut grove. My total monthly expenses, including food, my housekeeper who comes twice a week, and my blood pressure medication, came to around $900. On my $2,400 monthly income, I was saving more money at 68 than I had at any point during my working career. Gary introduced me around. Within 2 months, I had a regular group of 6 or 7 expats I'd have dinner with most weeks. A retired school teacher from Ohio, a divorced former airline pilot from Texas, a widow from Manitoba named Sandra who, I'll admit, I've grown quite close to over these 3 years, though I won't get into all of that in this video. The first few months were, honestly, some of the freest I'd felt since I was in my 20s. I woke up when I wanted to. I fished off the little dock near my house most mornings. I didn't answer to a wife's schedule, a boss's schedule, or 31 years of quiet compromise. For the first time in a long time, my calendar belonged entirely to me. I won't sit here and tell you it was all sunshine and clear water, because that wouldn't be honest, and I promised you honesty at the start of this. Around month 5, Michelle called to tell me she was pregnant with my first grandchild. I sat on that porch after we hung up and felt something crack open in my chest. Pure joy, mixed with a sharp, sudden grief that I was going to be experiencing all of this from 8,000 miles away, on a laggy video call, instead of in the delivery room hallway, the way my own father had been for me. There were nights the loneliness caught up with me too, especially in that first year. Dinner with a group of expat friends is a wonderful thing, but it isn't the same as 31 years of shared history, even a quiet, fading history. Some nights I'd sit on that porch with a beer and think about Carol, not with regret about the divorce itself, but with a strange kind of grief for the life we'd built together, even the parts that had gone stale. You can be certain you made the right decision and still miss pieces of what you left behind. Both of those things were true for me at the same time, more often than I expected. I also had a scare with my health in year 2. A minor cardiac episode that had me in a small provincial hospital for 4 days. Lying in that hospital bed, an ocean away from my kids, was the first time I seriously questioned whether I'd made a mistake. Sandra came by every day with food and sat with me for hours, and Gary handled calling my kids to keep them updated. I got through that hospital scare, and it turned out to be nothing catastrophic. A minor arrhythmia, some medication adjustments, a stern lecture from the doctor about cutting back on salt and the local rum. But it forced me to sit with a question I'd been avoiding for 2 years. Was I actually building a life here, or was I just running away from Sacramento and calling it retirement? I decided to be honest with myself about it, so I did a few things differently. The first thing I did was set up real medical continuity. I found a good internist in Dumaguete, about an hour away by boat and tricycle, and I started seeing him every 3 months instead of just showing up at the provincial hospital when something went wrong. I also finally bought proper international health insurance, the kind that could airlift me to Manila or even back to the States if something serious happened. It cost me about $180 a month, and honestly, it was the best money I've spent since I got here, because it turned that fear from a vague, nagging thing in the back of my mind into a plan I actually trusted. The second thing I did was talk to my kids properly, the way I probably should have from the very beginning. I called Danny and told him about the hospital stay, and I asked him directly, "If something ever happens to me out here, I need you to know I'm not asking you to feel guilty about the distance. I made this choice with my eyes open, and I'd make it again." He got quiet for a minute, and then he said something that surprised me. He said, "Dad, I've never seen you this relaxed in my entire life. I used to think you and Mom being roommates was just what marriage looked like when people got older. Watching you out there, actually laughing again, that's worth something too." That conversation did more for my peace of mind than the insurance policy did, if I'm honest. The third thing, and probably the thing that changed the most for me, was Sandra. I mentioned her before and I said I wouldn't get into it, but I think it's worth saying at least this much. About a year and a half into living here, what started as dinners with a group of expat friends slowly turned into something else between the two of us. She'd lost her husband to a heart attack 6 years before I arrived, and neither of us went looking for this. It just happened, slowly, the way real things tend to happen when you're not forcing them. We're not married. At our age, honestly, neither of us feels the need to rush into that particular paperwork again. But we spend most days together now, and for the first time in over a decade, I go to bed at night next to somebody who actually wants to talk to me about her day. It's been 3 years now since I left Sacramento. My granddaughter, Michelle's little girl, just turned 2, and I've flown back twice to see her. Once right after she was born, and once for her first birthday. Both times, Carol and I ran into each other at family gatherings, and I want you to know, it wasn't uncomfortable the way you might expect. We're not friends exactly, but we're not enemies either. We're just two people who spent 31 years together, ended it honestly instead of bitterly, and are both, as far as I can tell, genuinely happier now than we were in that last decade of quiet roommate living. Carol's actually started dating a widower from her church, and when Michelle mentioned it to me, I found I meant it completely when I said I was glad for her. My monthly expenses here still run under $1,000. My pension and Social Security cover everything with room left to save. Something that never once happened during my working years in California, when every raise seemed to get swallowed by property taxes and insurance premiums before I even saw it hit my account. I fish most mornings off that same little dock. I've got a regular Tuesday dinner with Gary and the rest of our little expat circle that's become as reliable as any tradition I ever had back home. And most nights, Sandra and I sit on that porch with the ceiling fan going, and I think about how close I came to spending the last third of my life quietly disappearing next to somebody I used to love, simply because neither of us had the nerve to admit the marriage was over. I'm not going to sit here and tell you that leaving your marriage is the answer, because I don't believe that, and it would be irresponsible of me to say it. Some marriages are worth fighting for, worth counseling and rebuilding and putting real effort into. Mine had simply run its course, quietly, over 10 long years, and Carol and I both knew it long before either of us said it out loud. What I will tell you is this: if you're sitting in a house with someone you love, out of habit more than out of choice, if you're 65, 68, 70 years old, and telling yourself it's too late to want something different, I'm living proof that it isn't. It's not too late to be honest with yourself. It's not too late to build a smaller, quieter, cheaper life, somewhere the sun is warm, and discover that smaller doesn't mean lonelier. Sometimes it means the exact opposite. Was leaving Carol the best decision I ever made? I believe it was. Not because anything was wrong with her, and not because anything was wrong with the life we built, but because at some point, staying in a comfortable, familiar unhappiness stopped being safer than the fear of starting over. And on the other side of that fear, I found a fishing dock, a good woman named Sandra, a group of friends I never expected at nearly 70 years old, and a version of myself I'd honestly forgotten was still in there. If this story hit close to home for you, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. And if you're wondering what it actually took to make this move legally and financially at my age, stick around, because next week, I'm walking you through exactly how my SORV retirement visa and my pension transfer worked, step by step.